Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Creation Myths. Today, we have a really fun show. I've been looking forward to this one for a while. I'm thrilled to finally do it. Before we get into what we are going to be talking about tonight, let me just tell you all that I am joined. YouTube sounds good. We are joined by, right below me, the man of the hour right here, Mr. Anderson, newly minted YouTube sensation. You should subscribe to his channel if you have not done so already. It is, I don't know if the link is coming through in the description. If it's not, because just at Mr. Anderson crosses. But I will add the link if it's not working down there. Mr. Anderson, welcome. Tell us about yourself. You say at the top of every one of your videos that you're mean to people on the internet. Why do you do that?
Why do any of us do this? Yeah, so I'm a lawyer by training, and I kind of got started. I just watched far too many Kent Hovind debates on the internet, and I was kind of like just sort of like keeping sharp in terms of because he's very slippery, so he's good to kind of practice mentally when you're doing like cross examinations. And I'd watched so many that I was like, I should probably just do this because I know kind of now what needs to be said to this guy, and I was like not satisfied with the way that other people were doing it, with the exception of you, Dan, of course.
You don't have to flatter me; it's fine.
I don't know, but you're a very good debater. But so I was like, you know what, I should probably put up or shut up, because otherwise, if I try and tell other people how to do this, nobody's going to listen to me. So I was like, let's do it. And then I did Hovind, and then I moved on to some other more challenging characters like our friend Mr. Badinsky.
So just to be clear, because I recently watched a thing of yours talking about mitochondrial Eve and the time to most recent common ancestor. And I want to direct everybody, first of all, to Mr. Anderson's channel, because the stuff he does is kind of like annotated kind of debate stuff, much more focused, I think, than what we're going to be doing here, because it's really about the techniques of like pinning someone down, which with your background, that makes perfect sense. And just being able to get like do you agree with this? Yes. Okay. Do you agree with this? Yes. And what I want to ask you, because you did this with Donnie, I don't know, a few weeks ago. I have a bad sense of time. A few weeks ago-ish with like mitochondrial Eve or something. And like you were asking very precise, very good questions. So what is your biology background coming into this?
You are my biology
There
background.
You go. So that makes it even more impressive, because you're just coming into this and kind of learning as you go, and you're able to hone in on what like the key questions are. That's really
cool. And literally, like, I watch you and I watch Zach, and you are my primary sources when it comes to the biology stuff. And then I'll go and I'll read the odd paper, and like Zach has sent me to more than one paper, and it's taken me like literally like days, like hours over the course of days, like going to it, coming back to it to like understand it. And then I'm like texting him like, I don't know what pruning and grafting. I still don't know what pruning and grafting is like.
Well, that is an excellent segue to Dr. Zach Hancock. Who are you and why are you here?
I'm an evolutionary biologist. I'm currently a postdoc at the University of Michigan. I specialize in population genetics, phylogenetics, and I do a little bit of genome evolution. My PhD was mostly focused on the phylogenetics and molecular evolution of crustaceans. And I run a YouTube channel at TalkPopGen, where I mostly do some evolution education, mostly focus on population genetics, obviously. And then I also do a little bit of history and philosophy of science. And then I do get into sort of debunking pseudoscience, and mostly focused on creationists, but I've also done like race realist and some other stuff as well. So yeah, try to touch on a little bit of all the pseudoscience.
I've said this before, everybody, about Zach's channel, that if you like what I do and you want more details and more math, go to Zach's channel. Like, it is just longer, more detailed, more precise. You will get more information there. It's great. I love it. I watch all his videos. I learn stuff from them. I encourage everybody to go spend some time with Zach's population genetics material, his history of evolutionary theory. It's all wonderful, and everybody should watch it. Okay, so we are gathered here tonight to talk about a debate that Mr. Anderson had with our mutual friend, Donnie Deals, aka Standing for Truth. So what we're going to do is we are going to pull this up. We're not going to watch the whole thing because it's like an hour something long, hour and 20 minutes ish. We're not going to watch the whole thing. We're going to jump around. We're going to pull out some key moments, and we're going to talk about them. And we're going to see how this goes. What I want everybody to be thinking about, because if I remember to do this at the end, I'm gonna put it right here, and I'm gonna ask everybody to remind me to do this at the end. I'm gonna put a poll on YouTube at the end of this, and the poll is going to be: is Donnie ignorant of the stuff we're talking about? Is he lying about it? And then just today, I was tuned in to a third possibility that he's faking all of it, doesn't believe any of it, and he's just doing the grift thing. So I'm gonna make a poll later, and we'll see what everybody thinks after we go through all of this stuff. So that is the plan for tonight, everybody. So we're gonna pull this. We're gonna pull this up.
Substitution rate is not the same.
Oh, you don't want to hear that yet. Not yet. All right. So I've checked the sound with the three of us here, but for the people on YouTube who are watching, just let us know if the sound is good. If it's too quiet, I'm going to turn it up just a hair just to make sure. But just let us know in the chat on YouTube if the sound is good. And we're going to pick it up here, and we're going to let this go for like a couple of minutes. But Zach and Mr. Anderson, at any point, just interrupt, and we can talk about whatever we want to talk about. Here we go.
Logical mutation, right? However, over long periods of time, right? So here's the fixation equilibrium that you understand.
What do you mean by fixation? I don't think you're using that word correctly. Do you mean mutation drift equilibrium?
Mutation drift equilibrium, I think in many ways applies to mutations, beneficial mutations.
No, mutation drift equilibrium is the concept that when you have a population which has reached a local peak of fitness, that mutations are going to introduce, that most mutations are at that point going to be deleterious, and mutation is going to introduce variation, and then
more beneficial. There's going to be a counterbalance where now more beneficial mutations are accumulating than deleterious.
No.
Well, then explain yourself better, Mr. Anderson.
Yeah, no, I'm trying to. I'm trying to. Don't worry. I'm doing my best. I'm just not that bright.
Can I just I just want to comment on that moment, because when I went through this beforehand and listened to it, just that little bit of self-deprecation goes a long way. I really like that. Just
it's a Canadian thing, right? It's like such a Canadian thing.
I really like that little moment. Since we paused, Zach, I was watching your face during that. Do you have any thoughts so far?
Yeah. Okay. So we should be pretty clear on this. So mutation drift equilibrium it's a lot of it is in the name, right? So let's remember what these two processes are doing: mutation and drift. Mutation adds new variation to the population. Drift removes variation from the population, right? So eventually what will happen is, if you let the population go long enough, the rate at which new mutations are added equals the rate at which drift removes them. And so what you end up with is an equilibrium level of diversity in the population, okay? And at equilibrium for a diploid population, that's equal to 4 times the population size times the mutation rate. And this was derived by Kimura and Crow in the 1960s. And so that's what mutation drift equilibrium is. It's sort of a mathematical expression of how much diversity we expect to be maintained in a population, irrespective of like selection, right? This is just drift and mutation, and they will reach an equilibrium because they're counterbalancing each other.
Which is important for genetic entropy, because the point of genetic entropy is that there is no equilibrium point. The mutations just accumulate infinitely until everybody is dead. And that, like, before you even introduce like selection into the equation, that flies in the face of well-established, well-documented, like very robust, very basic population genetics. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, and we'll get into this a little bit later. I don't want to spoil it, but it is mutation drift equilibrium is also reliant on the fact that there is no fitness impact of any of these mutations, right? And so the 4NV of mu, that equilibrium rate that I just described, is for neutral mutations, and specifically for strictly neutral mutations where the fitness of impact is exactly 0. When it's not exactly 0, it's a little bit more complicated than that.
Which I think that's foreshadowing.
That is maybe a little foreshadowing.
So at a localized peak, right? Like once you get, it's kind of like, when you hit the top, there's nowhere to go but down, right? So if a creature reaches its maximal sort of level of fitness for a given environment, and that environment doesn't change, then most mutations that occur are going to be deleterious, just because there's nowhere to go but down, right? And so then it's going to introduce mutation, like mutation is going to introduce variation, and then selection is going to remove that mutation. And that's selection mutation equilibrium.
Yeah,
right?
so here's mutation drift equilibrium right here. Mutation drift equilibrium.
I just want to comment how rude that was, because he didn't listen to an effing word you just said. He was still doing the last thing, going through his slides, not paying attention at all. Which is what Kent does too. He's learning his debate techniques from Kent, like just not listening at all, just buzzwords, slides. That's it. It's
Yeah,
just like,
I was just say the same thing. That's very much a Kent Hovind thing to do, is like to be scrolling through your slides as the other person is talking.
Yeah.
I think that there is something to point out here, is that I think Mr. Anderson and Donnie are talking about two different things here, right? So the mutation drift equilibrium is what I was describing before. I think what Mr. Anderson here is talking about is actually the concept of an adaptive landscape. Right. And so you can think about an adaptive landscape as a sort of topography of different fitnesses, where sort of the X and Y axis represents all possible phenotypic combinations. So it can be more than two-dimensional. It's really multi-dimensional. But across this landscape, you have peaks and valleys, where peaks are the highest points of fitness, and then the valleys are places of phenotypic combinations that are really low fitness. When you are, let's say, in a valley, or you're at the edge of a mountain, you're not at the peak, then the distribution of possible mutational effects are actually quite broad. You can get really good mutations if you are far away from a peak. But once you get to that peak, any subsequent mutations, by nature of you being the most fit you can possibly be in that environment, are going to be deleterious on average, right? And so this is the sort of adaptive landscape concept that Mr. Anderson here is pointing out. That I've also tried to make this point with Donnie and them before. I tried to make this point with Paul Price, and it just went straight over their heads. But it is a super important concept when you think about how the distribution of fitness effects evolves, because it's a thing that itself evolves. It's not a fixed thing, and it evolves as a function of where you exist on that fitness landscape.
Mr. Anderson, you want to add anything?
No, that's what I was going for.
Which I love the way you described that. I think that was a great way to like paint a very clear picture of what we're talking about here.
Is a standard part of many evolutionary models. Given many millions of years, one would expect genomes to become saturated with mutations, reaching.
Oh, was that? Sorry, I can't tell whether it's the Mr. Anderson that's here live or it's the Mr. Anderson in the video sometimes that's talking. So I thought that was live, but that was in the video. Sorry, everybody. That was my misunderstanding.
An equilibrium where the number of new mutations is balanced by the number of mutations lost through random drift and purifying selection. So it's not the same thing as fixation equilibrium that I'm talking about.
Well, yeah, okay. I don't know what this is, but I was talking about mutation selection equilibrium.
Okay.
But I don't know what this mutation drift equilibrium is then.
So
something
fixation equilibrium that Chris Roop and I have wrote about is simply the fact that over long evolutionary timescales, your per generation neutral mutation rate will equal the fixation rate. And so if 50 mutations are, if 50 mutations
for neutral mutations, right?
Neutral, yeah, of course, because
not for nearly neutral mutations.
Nearly neutral as well.
No,
because,
nearly neutral, you got to use a different formula.
No, because nearly neutral mutations are not subject to selection, and so they act as neutral
No.
to selection, but because they have only slightly deleterious effects, they still drift, and they would drift to fixation. That's genome wide or population wide genetic
Hang on,
damage.
I'll get just give me a sec.
I love this. Is like I got to go get my book. Like,
I love that moment too.
I'm gonna go get my notes.
Well, because I wasn't, like this debate. Remember that this came after my second debate with Hovind, right? And so I just done like a 2-hour debate with Hovind, and then this was like a Q&A kind of a thing, and we just kind of got into it, and I was like I hadn't specifically prepared for this, right?
Sure.
So, and he was like, he brings this up, and I'm like, I took some, like I actually watched one of your videos, Zach, and took some notes on this, because I was like, in the back of my head, I was like, if I debate Ken Hovind again, then Donnie's going to try and skewer me on this genetic stuff, so I better learn it. And good thing.
Yeah.
Right. So so I just had a notebook that I'd written that and formula down in.
Yeah. Do we want to talk about what nearly neutral, like what Donnie is trying to get at here? He also mentioned something about long evolutionary timescales, mutation drift equilibrium. What long evolutionary timescales is a relative. It's relative to the effective population size of the organism. So if for NE, if you are an organism with a very small NE, then long is actually pretty short. Like you can have a relatively small coalescence time, and then you're really rapidly back in mutation drift equilibrium. Long can be a few thousand years. It can be hundreds of millions of years. It depends on the effective size of the population.
Just to jump in, everybody. So N, it's when you say NE, but it's capital N and then lowercase subscript e. That's effective population size, which is different from capital N, which is just number of individuals in the population. The effective population size is a measure of the reproducing individuals. It's about the genetic content of the population, not just the number of individuals in that population. So you can have, for example, a very large population size, but a very small effective population size if that population does not have a lot of genetic variation in it. It's the genetic equivalent of relatively few individuals is what we're talking about here.
Yeah, like
go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that, like, a good way, the way that I understood it kind of as a layperson was, and I think this was probably you, Dan, that explained it this way, was like for Noah and the Ark, right? There's 8 people, I think, on the Ark, right? There's Noah, his wife, 3 sons, and 3 and their 3 wives, right? So you'd think, okay, well, so there's 8. There's a population of 8, but the effective population there is 5, because 3 of those 3 sons all have the same mom and dad, so they're not as different as all that, right? So it's really only the 2 mom and dad plus the 3 wives. Those are the people that you count here. The 3 sons don't count because they're just mixtures of those 2 parents. So even though there's 8 people, there's only 5. There's only an effective population size of 5. That's
the max. That's the maximum it could be, because so the effective population size is actually a measure of gene copies, and this gets a little weird because of recombination. But what you're basically talking about is the effective number of gene copies. So, for example, if all of Noah's children happen to be homozygous at one locus, that's an effective size of 1. For that particular locus, there is 1 individual that represents it because they all have the same allele. Right. And so in this case, like the effective size is different across the genome, thanks to recombination. And it's almost always less than the census population size because of things like inbreeding and because of various mating structures. So what I like to think about in terms of like what is the effective population size is it measures the rate of genetic drift. Right. And that's how quickly do alleles fluctuate in frequency. Right. So if you think about an infinite population under like Hardy-Weinberg expectations, that you have no change in allele frequencies, they should remain exactly the same. But as you get further and further and further away from an infinite population, just by chance alone, you get bigger fluctuations. right? So the bigger the fluctuation, the smaller your effective size is, the faster drift can happen, right? So the effective population size is much like the selection coefficient. The selection coefficient measures the strength of selection. N sub E, the effective population size, measures the strength of genetic drift. And that's why when we get into like these genetic entropy models, what we're really interested in is the interaction between these two terms, right? And which one of these two terms are going to win out in the end tells us, irrespective of the selective effect or the effective drift, whether that allele is going to fixation or be lost.
I want to make a couple of comments really fast. One is we have an entry into the kind of meta debate topic here of, does he know this stuff? And the question is, I learned this as an undergraduate. How does SFT not know this? Yeesh. Which is a fair question. So, however you want to, incorporate that into your prior model here for lying or just doesn't know population genetics.
I mean, in fairness, I did not learn this in my undergrad, right?
Presumably,
I feel like you'd have to be a biology major.
he has. I think he has a life science background, though. I think he has a life science background. I think that was before the car salesman. But anyway, the other thing is that we should just briefly touch on strictly neutral, effectively neutral, nearly neutral, because these are all related terms, but they're all shades of gray, right? They're all slightly different from each other. And that matters, as Mr. Anderson said, like they are different. And it's good we just spent a minute clarifying effective population size, because things like whether an allele is neutral or, to use the word that we, the kind of shorthand, selectable, right? Can it be subject to natural selection rather than drift, is related to the effective population size. Mm-hmm. So, Zach, I'm just going to toss this to you because this is like your thing. So strictly neutral, we all understand, like you can change that nucleotide and it has literally no effect. There is A, T, C, G, doesn't matter, all the same, strictly neutral. But then we have nearly neutral and we have effectively neutral. So take it.
Yeah, so you can think about it like this. And if at any point there's confusion, stop me and I'll try to reword it and clarify.
Zach, before we do this, I do just want to point out that we have covered approximately 3 minutes of video.
Oh, that's fantastic. We're on a roll right now.
This is gonna be like a 7-part series.
Like no time at all. We better slow down.
We probably should, because I mean, like, if you guys want to be like, if we're being honest, this is already a very high level discussion for anybody who does not have a life sciences background. Like, we are actually concept-wise going very fast. So
yeah, so that's my point. As I want to try to explain this in a way that like people like really understand. So if you think about any allele, any genetic variant, every single generation, some proportion of the population harbors this genetic variant, and then some proportion doesn't. And the number of individuals that have it, every single generation has a variance, a fluctuation, right? And that fluctuation is just due to chance, right? There's some variation that happens where sometimes you give more of that allele than other times. So if you were to track it through time, it would kind of do this, right? It kind of jumps around through time. Okay. Now let's say that particular allele has some effect on how many offspring you have, right? It has some fitness effect. And let's say it's like makes you leave slightly fewer offspring than if you didn't have this, right? Okay. So now what happens is selection is trying to get rid of that allele. It's purposely trying to purge it. But if the per generation effect that selection is having on that variation is smaller than the variation itself, then we call that nearly neutral. Because what that means is that drift is actually causing the change in the frequency of that allele to be greater in magnitude than what selection can change that frequency. So selection is still acting on it. It's just drift has a greater effect due to just the chance impacts for per generation. Does that make sense? Mr. Anderson, did you follow? Do you feel like you followed that?
Yeah. So there's a thing I should clarify, and that is that so I am technically misusing the term nearly neutral throughout this debate, and that is sort of by accident, but sort of on purpose. And the reason is because if I try and stick with the very strict technical definitions, then this all going to get lost on them, right? And so when I'm using the word nearly neutral in the debate, what I'm saying is that we're talking about those traits that are straddling that line of selectability, where the size of the population and the selection coefficient, if they change by reasonable amounts, it will actually make a difference. Where, like, it will, that for that trait, it's actually going to depend on the selection coefficient and the population size to determine whether or not it is effectively neutral or selectable, right? Which is technically wrong, because a nearly neutral mutation is technically an unselectable mutation. It's one that is...
It's not unselectable.
It's just
right.
Proportionally, the changes in its frequency are being driven more by drift than by selection, but the proportion of that's driven by selection is not zero. So what you actually said in the debate moment that we just watched a second ago, when Donnie was insisting, like, well, you got to treat that as neutral. No, you were correct to say that. No,
I'm
the
more
math is
correct
actually...
than I thought I was. I'm glad to be wrong about how wrong I was.
You were correct to say that. No, the math is different there, because it's not that it's not that if something is... He likes to talk about this, the zone of no selection, and if your effect on fitness is within that zone, it's not zero selection. It's proportional to the effect that drift has, but it's not zero. It doesn't... You cross that line, it immediately goes to zero. That's not how it works. Yeah,
it can't overcome the variance every single generation that drift is causing, basically. And another way to, like, maybe a simple way, like a mathematical way to think about it, is like if you have S and videos over here, if you have S as the selection coefficient, and then let's say N of E, it's technically 1 over N of E. If 1 over N of E is your rate of drift, if those two values equal each other, right, then that allele, despite having some effect, is effectively neutral, right? It behaves as if it is neutral because the amount of selection impacting it is exactly equal to the amount of drift that's impacting it. Does that maybe help clarify it a little bit?
Yeah. No, I think that's clear. So anyways, that's kind of that's what we're talking about. So in the debate, when we're talking about nearly neutral mutations, we're talking about mutations that are, near that line where it's kind of like, it is partially subject to selection, or, the degree to which it's subject to selection is going to actually be dependent. It's not clear whether or not it's selectable or not.
Yeah. And technically the probability is always less than the rate of drift. Even if you go back to the original Kimura papers in 71, it's approximately equal to the rate of drift, but it's actually technically always some number less. So even effectively neutral mutations never quite reach the rate that you would expect under drift alone. It's always some number less. And you make this point later on, again, spoilers. You make this point later on that the effective population size, it really, really matters in this case, right? So one person's junk is another person's garbage in this case. They're like, what is effectively neutral in one population is strongly selected in a different population.
Yeah. Which is to say, in the context of this debate, Donnie, who's been doing this for literally years, he has been doing this since well before I was on YouTube, which was 2020, because this started as a pandemic hobby. And he'd been doing this already for some amount of time before that. He's wrong about this, even though he says what he just said in the debate that we just saw. He says that all the time. That's wrong. Mr. Anderson, who, relatively speaking, just got here. Welcome to the party, pal. Was right. So what I did here in the video is I jumped forward a little bit to our next time point. It's going to run. What we'll do is this. I'm going to run it for 3 minutes, because we're never going to come anywhere near finishing this if we stop every 20 seconds and then chat about PopGen for 15 minutes. So what we're going to do is we're going to let this run for 3 minutes, approximately. Take notes during the 3 minutes. I'm keeping time. Take notes, and then we'll boom, and we'll talk about what we just saw. So let's do that. Here we go.
Finish my point. I know you got a book, so you'll have a point to make.
No, it's just notes. Go ahead.
Okay. So the author, Dr. Rob Carter, he says, however, over long periods of time in a population and mutation drift equilibrium, the two are nearly equal. There is also not, as he claims, a conflict between the thought that A, most mutations are lost to drift, and B, and this is what I point out, the mutation rate is approximately the same as the fixation rate. Why? Because even if most mutations are lost, in a large population, many are not. And Fatuma, he points out in this evolutionary textbook on PopGen that we're looking at, if you continue the quote, Mr. Anderson, and then I'll let you respond. If you continue the quote here, where he says the rate of fixation mutations is theoretically constant equals the mutation rate, the neutral mutation rate, he begins to talk about population size. And he says population size is not going to affect this because in a large population, fixation's slower, but you have many more mutations entering the population and spreading throughout the population. In a small population, you have less mutations entering the population and spreading throughout the population because less individuals, but you have faster rates of.
Oh, you're silent.
You're muted, Dan. You're still muted?
I
was
can
muted.
hear you, Zach, but I can't hear Dan.
I was mute. I had muted myself, so you didn't hear me like typing and stuff during that. And then I didn't unmute myself. I said, I'm going to break my own rule for a second here. And just to highlight this comment, well, at least he's pronouncing Fatuma correctly, which is better than Jensen. So congratulations.
You get the better than Jensen award.
You get the better than Jensen, which is it's not a good award, but it's something.
It's a low bar.
It's a low bar. Congratulations.
Fixation. And so there's a counterbalance there where this rule essentially still applies. Go ahead, Mr. Anderson.
Yeah, I agree with that. For neutral for neutral mutations, that's true. The problem occurs when you are trying to use nearly neutral mutations, because when you do that, it's different, right? And the reason it's different is because with neutral mutations, like that's correct, right? The more people you have, the longer, the longer it's going to take to spread out across the population. But by the same token, the more neutral mutations there will be, right? With a nearly neutral mutation, it's a little bit different because the question then becomes, how nearly neutral is it, right? Because not all nearly neutral mutations are created equal. And a nearly neutral mutation is a mutation which is close enough to being neutral that evolution, or selection, I should say, doesn't see it. And it's going to not see it depending on how many times it gets a look at it, right? And that is going to depend on two things. The first one is, how bad is it, right? How nearly neutral is it? And the second one is population size. And there's two ways to calculate population size, right? There's effective population size, and then there's like how many people are there, right? So the formula is that the probability of fixation of a nearly neutral mutation is not just equal to the mutation rate. It is 2ne over n all over 1 minus e to the negative 4ne times s. Right? So it's just a much more complicated formula, right?
Okay, that's where that bit, we said we're going to delineate that. I just want to point out again what like a disrespectful jerk Donnie is being by, instead of like listening, he's just flipping through his slides, trying to like find the thing, like, well, how can I rebut this? And like, just listen, use your brain for once instead of Rob Carter's brain.
I mean, it doesn't do him any favors anyways. He would have been better off just listening, right? Like, you never see me flipping through slides, and there's a reason for that. And it's because I'm listening, because that's how you question off the last answer and effectively argue, right?
He's doing the Kent thing where it's just buzzwords and find the slides and pull it up, which is, there's a reason he doesn't leave his own channel anymore, ever. And like, this is why he can't control the screen if he's somewhere else, so he can't flip through his slides if he's not, in his own little sandbox. That's what I got for that section. I think that was a good explanation. I think that was like, yeah, it's a different formula. Once you're not dealing with strictly neutrals, it's a different formula. They accumulate at a different rate. The math is different. What are you talking about?
Yeah, I agree. And I think this is that right. They always do this sort of bait and switch where they go back to like, well, the pedigree mutation rate is this, and we see mutation drift equilibrium, and they're equating the fact that mutation drift equilibrium happens to have mutation in it, and then they just drop the fact that, well, we're talking about strictly neutral mutations in this context, whereas the pedigree mutation rate includes all mutations, many of which are deleterious and are going to get purged, right? So the rate of mutation that you're getting from pedigrees will always be higher than any mutation that we would be talking about in the mutation drift equilibrium model.
Right. And that's kind of like, that was the real point of me introducing sort of this concept, was that like, if we're going to include any, any mutations which have any degree of selectability, then you have to use this formula. Mm-hmm. And so that's, you could use the pedigree rate with this formula, because then you're just going to have to plug in the selection coefficients of all of those different selectable mutations. And then that's going to, show that most of them are going to get eliminated, and then you're fine. Right.
Yeah, well, those studies, they don't measure fitness effects of these mutations. And this is kind of an important point, right? It's like they're literally just counting, like they're doing broad sequencing across, many generations, and then they're just counting along the lineages, right? They're not actually asking the question of like, what is the fitness effect of all of these mutations? And so they don't have the data to actually plug into these. Now, you can't do it with humans, but we have done this in Drosophila, we've done this in yeast, we've done this in Arabidopsis, we've done this in a ton of organisms. And we
just tell the viewers why is it that we can't do this in humans? What do you have to do in order to identify the selection coefficients, and why is that unethical in humans?
Well, I mean, for obvious reasons, right? Like,
well, not to everybody, just because not everybody knows how this is done.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you would need to like basically be able to control reproduction, right? You would have to be able to completely control, one, for the environment, and then you would have to secondly control for who you mate with to be able to extract the reproductive benefit of having a particular allele. Right. Which is
who do you have to force me to mate with in order for me to get a homozygous allele that you can then evaluate its fitness effects?
Yeah, well, I mean, in like most situations, you would do inbreeding, right? You would inbreed a population over and over and over. You make them homozygous, and then actually we would then do mutation accumulation experiments, and then that'll actually allows you to differentiate the effects of alleles once they're homozygous. So that's how we would do it in basically any other organism.
Definitely can't do that in people. You can't do that in people. You will get arrested. Don't
successfully interbreed them, inbreed them over and over again, just to try and figure out which of their genes are.
Yeah, I mean there are ways to get the fit. So like we do have measures of effects of mutations in humans. It's just a bit more statistically complicated to do it. And I feel like I could explain it, but we would really, really get into the weeds. So just note there are some ways to do it, but it is a lot of statistics to pull it.
And it's retrospective, right?
It is retrospective. Yeah. You're taking allele frequencies. You're looking at the rate at which they have changed, and you know something about the rate at which they should change under drift versus the rate at which they should change if selection is acting, and you can fit a curve. Right. And so there's like some statistics going on behind the scenes here that allows you to do this in humans.
I just want to point out that when Zach Hancock says we're going to have to get into the weeds here, and there are some statistics, that is code for none of you will understand any of this at all.
I think everybody would follow. It might take us 45 minutes, but I think we'd get it.
It would take the whole rest of the stream, basically.
It would, like let's pull up the Habsburg pedigree and talk about one thing before we move to our next segment here. I just want to point out that there's also a thing creationists do here that like all the time is you get like, I'm going to talk about this one thing, and then in the next sentence you get modifiers, you get nearly, approximately, like, well, hang on, now that's not the same thing. You can't just treat those things as the same. Donnie does this all the time. He starts talking about neutral, and then it's nearly neutral, and those accumulate at approximately the same rate. Okay, but approximately is not the same, and that changes the math. and it doesn't work anymore.
It changes the math a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's something everybody to like watch out for because, you know. All right. So we're going to jump. Actually, we're not going to jump. We're going to jump marginally here. And then we're going to do another like 3 minutes. And yeah, we're actually going to stay right there. We're going to do 3 minutes. Same game. Here we go.
And that's the basis for so for every mutation that you do or that you want to calculate, it's going to depend A, on population size, and B, on how nearly neutral is the mutation, right? So what's going to end up happening is that some of these mutations are like, the closer it is to neutral, the more likely it is to get to fixation, right? And the smaller the population size, the less close to neutral it has to be before it's got a pretty good probability of reaching fixation. So the really bad mutations never reach fixation.
Well, the really bad mutations would be subject to selection. And that's the whole point is you're trying to make the no selection zone in terms of these neutral mutations. You're trying to make it as small as possible. When in reality, I didn't interrupt you. Let me just finish. If you disagree, just note it down like a debater does, and you can respond to it. The problem is there's so much in terms of genetic noise. There's selection interference where you have all these traits segregating in the population that your most beneficial ones are just never even amplified because of the noise. There's so much going on in the genome that what you're arguing seems to me to be very one-dimensional and counter to what a lot of these evolutionary scientists in the field are saying. Like right here, Iyer, Walker, and Keatley, they say it seems unlikely that any mutation is truly neutral in the sense that it has no effect on fitness. And so where you say, and this is where I'd like you to speak, it sounds like you're agreeing that, okay, the same number of neutral mutations should be fixed every generation. The rate of fixation mutations is theoretically constant, equals the neutral mutation rate. So you're saying this does not apply to the nearly neutral or effectively neutral mutations, though. Is that what you're saying, Mr. Anderson?
Yeah, that's right. Because for effectively neutral or nearly neutral, that depends. And it depends on how nearly neutral they are, A, and B, it depends on what's your population size. So let's say and here's kind of the problem, as I understand it, with like the genetic entropy model, is that let's say, for example, that you've got a mutation which is nearly neutral, right? And it's spreading across the population and it's drifting towards fixation because it is within that no selection zone on its own, right? Like a time bomb, right? And then you've got your trigger, right? So it's like this mutation and that mutation on their own, they're neutral. There's no fitness cost, right? But together, there is, right? Then what that means is that they're never going to both reach fixation, because whenever, let's say one of them reaches fixation first and everybody's got it, right? That means then that if it is deleterious, if it has an effect on fitness, and fitness, I'm defining fitness in the conventional sense, right?
Reproductive.
If it has an effect on fitness, then it'll have an effect on fitness, which means selection will see it and it'll be subject to purifying selection, right? It'll never reach fixation because its value of S gets bumped up, which screws up the whole formula. So first off, like that first half of stuff that he just said, like, I mean, am I correct in saying that was some word salad? And he was kind of, I think, just talking while he like thought about what
he's quoting Sanford. So when he talks about no selection zone, genetic noise, like this is Sanford terms.
Just straight up but it goes through the standing
it just sounded
for
like
truth.
word salad to me. I was like, nothing you're saying is making sense right now, and I'm just going to wait until you start saying things that make sense. And
this is correct. Like he doesn't, like if you said, explain the math behind the thing you just said, he couldn't do it, right? No chance, none. He just parroting Sanford. Earlier he did it with Carter. It's just, just quoting people without understanding the words is what's happening there. Yes.
Yeah, and like this idea of like the no selection zone, I would love for them to define what this is. This is a thing that like even Sanford in his book doesn't clearly define. I did a whole video trying to like clarify what this quote unquote no selection zone is. Basically, it's just supposed to be the zone of effective neutrality, right? So it's the zone within which the selection coefficient is so small that it's equal to or less than the rate of genetic drift. Like that's the no selection zone.
Which, by the way, I called that one earlier. So if you've got your genetic entropy bingo card and or drinking game, drink responsibly, folks. There you go.
He also says genetic noise. I would love for them to tell me what counts as genetic noise. Is that just another word for drift? What do we mean when we say genetic noise? And then he uses the phrase selection interference. Donnie, I would love for you to explain to me what selection interference is. Because I suspect you don't know what selection interference is, but I would love for you to explain.
I don't know what selection interference is.
So what selection interference is?
Hang on, Donnie. If you're watching this, pause it right here. You have to pause and jump ahead 3 minutes, okay? Because that would be cheating.
That would be cheating.
As Zach gestures with a dry erase marker, because
this is what I'm taking notes with.
Yeah, I'm like if I say something that's like truly incorrect, then Zach just like pulls out this whiteboard and he's like, "Look, let me explain it to you."
I have a whiteboard right here.
That's right now.
Yeah. No. Okay. So selection interference, which is technically called Hill-Robertson interference, because they're the ones that first uncovered it. What it basically is you can imagine you have two loci that are both being positively selected, right? But they're on different haplotypes. And so one is trying to spread and the other is.
In other words, Zach, if I may, you have two separate things that are both beneficial that are separate from each other. They're competing with each other, so they both can't increase in frequency.
Exactly. So they end up interfering with one another's ability to increase. So they both end up just like going back and forth, segregating in the population. So that's selection interference because they're interfering with one another's ability to go to fixation.
Oh, okay. I thought we were talking about like positive epistasis or something like that.
Yeah. And eventually what happens in the case of eukaryotes, we can actually get this is really a problem in asexual organisms because in eukaryotes, recombination breaks this up. So you can have recombination happen, you get them both on the same background, and then they can
reach fixation faster because you could select for both at the same time.
Exactly.
Yep. So that is like the reason that if you compete, all else being equal, sexual versus asexual, like that is one of the big reasons that sexual wins despite the cost of it. It's because you can fix beneficial mutations faster and you can decouple them from the deleterious mutations that are linked to them because of recombination.
Yeah, mathematically you can see Hill-Robertson interference in eukaryotes, but like empirically, the only time you ever actually see it is in prokaryotes because they can't.
What's like an example of that?
Just think about bacteria in a petri dish, right? And you expose them to antibiotics, and there are two mutations that will confer some degree of resistance. And when you have both of them together, that's an additive where it'll have more resistance, right? So you could have mutation A, you could have mutation B. Whichever of them confers more resistance is going to win. And then to get the combination of A and B together, mutation B has to occur within the lineage that already has mutation A. So you can't have both of them at the same time increasing in frequency. It has to be one, then the other. Whereas if you're a sexual eukaryote, those two lineages can mate with each other. They can recombine, and now you can get genotype AB without having to compete them with each other and get them in order.
Yeah, you can think about if in a petri dish, A and B have exactly the same benefit, but they're technically different mutations, right? And they're both providing you resistance to antibiotics. They can't both go to fixation. And in fact, as they're both increasing in frequency, they're counterbalancing each other because they're technically different mutations that arose on different lineages.
Yeah. Right. Okay, I get it.
Yeah,
I get it.
Which again, not a problem in practical terms for a sexually reproducing eukaryote. So he's talking about this in the context of genetic entropy, which is like a human thing, right? That's what Sanford's talking about. He's talking about humanity is going to go extinct because of this. That process, which Donnie does not know what that is. He doesn't know what those words mean. It doesn't apply. It doesn't apply. All right, Donnie, you can start watching again.
Yeah.
Do we have anything
listen,
else there, folks?
Yeah. The other important thing that I wanted to note was, so like there's two models of genetic entropy that we talk about here, and sometimes they get conflated, and it's important like to kind of keep these distinct in your mind. And the one that we talk about mostly in this debate is what I call the time bomb model, right? So that's where you have, a number of, let's just use 2 because it's the smallest number that this makes sense with, but it could be any number, right? But you have like, say, 2 mutations and one of them is like the bomb and one of them is the trigger, right? And you have to have both of them at the same time for genetic meltdown to occur. And that's one kind of sort of genetic entropy where you've got these 2 different alleles bouncing around in this system or in the population. And if both of them reach fixation, then the whole population goes extinct. The other kind is what I call like the lobster pot model, which is where you've got like one that goes and it like makes it a little bit worse and it reaches fixation. And then another one that goes and it makes it a little bit worse. And that one reaches fixation. And there's no way that you can, that selection is going to be able to stop it because everybody has the first one by the time the second one comes along, and the lobster pot just gets a little bit hotter and a little bit hotter and a little bit hotter until eventually the lobster boils. So that one has its own problems.
I love these terms.
I love it too. This is great.
They are models that already exist.
Right. This is great though. This is fantastic. This is somebody who like doesn't know this stuff being like, this is one way this could happen. Yeah. This is the other thing that can happen. And what you're describing are actual phenomena in population genetics. This
they
is
are
great.
The first one you described is called synergistic epistasis. That's the technical term. I like time bomb better, maybe, but it's synergistic epistasis. It's effectively, you have 2 loci that aren't the same, like they're 2 different positions in the genome, and they mutate, right? And so long as you don't have both of them on the same background, you're okay. Maybe you have a little bit lower fitness, but in general, you will be okay. But if they occur on the same background, it explodes, right? It causes a massive fitness decline, right? And that's so instead of having what we call an additive model, where you could take the fitness effect of one by itself and just add it to the fitness effect of the other by itself, and then predict what the like impact on fitness would be if you had both. And in this case, you can't do that because when they're together, they don't act in an additive way. They act in a much different way, a much more complicated way. And that's what synergistic epistasis is.
And just to be with the word synergistic, what we're going for here, because you could also have antagonistic epistasis where they kind of operate against each other, right? Where you have one effect in one context, but then this other mutation occurs, now you get a different, like you get the directionally different effect. Yeah. Right. So it's when we say like synergistic versus antagonistic, those are not synonyms for beneficial and harmful, right? It refers to the direction of the effect in terms of, and you could have synergistic. Right.
So synergistic epistasis could still be like, they're synergistically bad.
Right. Exactly.
Together, they
multiply each other. It just means that they add together rather than they cancel each other out.
Yes, that's
so because we're later going to talk about Paul Price and his glorious mustache, right? And if we had like considering the importance, to the survival of the species of glorious mustaches, right? If you had like thicker hairs, that's fine, that's neutral. And you had like thinner pores or like hair follicle tubules,
you have more
right?
density, right?
Well, I mean, like the actual like tube is narrower.
Oh,
right?
I got you. Okay.
Like that's neutral. But if you had both of those together, then then the hair can't get out of there. And then now you're going to just have ingrown hairs. And you can't grow a glorious mustache anymore. And now you're never going to be able to have as many kids as you want because of the lack of a glorious mustache, right? So like that would be synergistic epistasis in a bad way. Have I got that basically right?
Yeah, you got it.
That's it.
Okay.
I like time bomb model personally. I think that's great.
Yeah. And then the other one, the lobster pot, is just like the basic, like the traditional classic way you would estimate genetic load, right? Is where you just consider every single loci contributes additively. And this is where we get like the mutation load paradox and stuff like that. It's from this sort of additive model. But the more and more we've learned about the genetics, the more and more we realize that loci are interacting epistatically all the time, such that these sorts of additive models very rarely actually capture the real complexity of genomes.
Yeah, and we almost exclusively talk about sort of the time bomb model in this debate, and partially that's just because that's what we talk about. Partially that's because like all the examples that these guys use of like instances where there is genetic entropy are like, you know, very rare genetic diseases and stuff like that, which are the time bomb model.
Yeah.
Right? Like
And,
all of there is no example of which I'm aware of lobster pot genetic entropy.
and that's because if you were to do the lobster pot approach, what has to happen is not just that these mutations have to accumulate, but everybody in the population has to experience them. Because if you have a subset of the population, right, that has one of those bad mutations, if it is actually bad, right, it's causing a time-dependent decline in fitness, then as you correctly said a moment ago that we watched, if there is that like detectable decrease in fitness, which correctly defines, you know, reproductive output, then that is by necessity going to be selected against. It's going to decrease in frequency. It becomes less likely to achieve fixation. So you don't have this linear accumulation of mutations leading to a linear decline in fitness. So what creationists describe is that you have a situation where you have all these below threshold mutations, and all of a sudden fitness falls off a cliff once you hit a threshold level of accumulation. So they're like, by necessity, creationists acknowledge basically that the lobster trap or the lobster pot model, lobster trap model is a different thing. The lobster pot model like doesn't work. Like even they'll acknowledge that like that won't work. You need to have the sudden drop off.
Yeah, I don't know if we want to talk about the problem of the lobster pot model associated with the time that it takes to boil that lobster now, or if we want to save that one for later.
I think let's save that. It's kind of an interesting like other side of the coin to waiting time problem, right? It's because that's basically how creationists treat like the accumulation of beneficial mutations when they're talking about the waiting time problem. They say, oh, it's going to,
we'll save
right?
it. Put a pin in that one, everybody. Okay. How long does it take to boil a lobster?
Okay, so we're going to go here for about 2 minutes, and then we'll pause and we'll chat for an indeterminate amount of time as we do. Eventually, we are going to run out of concepts in population genetics to talk about here. Well, I might. Zach won't.
See, the issue that I have is I believe you are underappreciating the just how nearly neutral even these neutral mutations are. Because like the quote from Iyer, Walker, and Keatley, they said no mutation should be truly neutral in the sense that it has no effect on fitness at all. And so I would argue that yes, even your strictly neutral mutations, if you want to call them that, they're still going to be slightly deleterious in the same way that a single rust molecule, you've heard this, on a vehicle is deleterious, but it's not going to destroy the car. It's the accumulating damage over time, or a single spelling mistake in a book the size of an encyclopedia. On its own, it's inconsequential, but as enough spelling mistakes accumulate over time, the message becomes muddled and the book becomes unreadable. And just like the genome, this is a ticking time bomb. I do think that the reproductive way of defining fitness is greatly flawed, because by the time the entire
let's not get into that. Just give me that one. We can talk about that later.
Well, I'll ask a clarifying question. So you have two neutral mutations, nearly neutral mutations, entering the population. Depending on the size of the population, it sounded like you said, okay, maybe one is strictly neutral, but then another one has an effect on that one that makes them both seen, and so selection removes them from the equation. Or did I misunderstand?
Selection would only remove the second one, probably.
Right? Okay. And then the other
so
one
like this is an example of what they call mutational load, right? So like you've said, like on many occasions, we're all multiply mutant, right? And so we do have these deleterious mutations that are often heterozygous and recessive, right? And when they hit homozygosity in a particular person, then like the time bomb goes off essentially, and there's a big problem, right? or even there's a little problem, right? But, so here's part of the thing is that, I'm sorry for diverting on this. Actually, I'll
By the way, sorry, I said 2 minutes. I meant 3 minutes. There's about like 50 seconds left here, and then we'll chat. Sorry, everybody.
finish that thought and then we'll go on to this other one. So what that means then is, let's just use the example of the big problem, but it's only a big problem if there's an accumulation, right? So at the point where there's enough of an accumulation of rust spots, for example, in the car, where it does have an effect on fitness, then that last mutation, which would actually cause a selection effect, is never going to reach fixation. Because as soon as it hits, as it starts to spread through the population, if those other things are already fixed, and now this is going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back, the straw that breaks the camel's back will never reach fixation because it is selectable.
A couple of quick things here. He mentioned a couple times there and previously the famous Our Walker paper. I just want to say bingo/drink to that one, because that's a favorite that comes up. It does not mean what they say it means. Like, you could spend an hour just like going through that paper. It does not mean what they say it means. Also, rust on a car. Bingo. Spelling mistakes building up as you hand copy a book. Bingo. This is like straight out of Sanford. And of course, it's been part of Donnie's repertoire here for as long as I have been aware of him. He's been saying these same silly things. And the redefining fitness, which I like how you stomped on that one real fast, Mr. Anders. It's just like, no, we're not doing that one. Like, just stop. We're not doing that. Yeah, this is all just he's doing his script. He has a script. He's doing the script. None of it makes sense. What are we even doing here? And I thought your response was spot on. And describing that was at the end there, describing how, eventually it hits that selection threshold. And if there's variation in the population, then it doesn't reach fixation. And then here we are. Yeah, I co-sign. Yes.
Yeah, the one point that I want to add is that at the very beginning, he begins with this, I don't think you're appreciating how nearly neutral they are thing. And this is actually pretty important because they can't be too nearly neutral. I've done the math, and I don't know if you'll be able to see this. But okay, so the genetic load, right? Can we see this okay? So L is load. It's equal to 1 minus S. 1 minus S is the effect of every single mutation, right? So, and then it's raised to the power of G. G is the number of loci that have the mutation. So if you mutated every single loci in the entire genome, if S is approximately equal to G, the load is negligible. You can mutate every single loci in the genome. So it's very important for you to not just know that it's nearly neutral. It has to actually have a big enough effect such that it exceeds the inverse of the genome size. And I talked about this before, but this is a result from Kondrashov, 1995, the paper they love to cite, but they never read it. This exact result was found in Kondrashov 95. So you can't just say, oh, it's nearly neutral. I don't think you're appreciating how slightly neutral
I struggle with that. I've heard you say that twice before, and I've like the first time I saw it, I rewound that video and watched it 4 times, and I still don't understand.
Okay. So I'll put some quick numbers to it. So let's say S is 1e to the negative 8. So you got 1 minus 1e to the negative 8 is S. And then the genome size is
quick numbers.
Quick numbers, 20 to the 8th, right? Okay. So that's 100 million. Okay. If that's the genome size, then we can do some quick math here. So that means that the load is equal to 0.63, so 63%. And so if we take the number of offspring that you would need to have, that's 0.63 divided by 1 minus 0.63, that's 1.7. So basically, you need to have 1.7 offspring on average to deal with that load, right? That's mutating every single loci in the genome to a less fit variant. You can have less than 2 offspring on average and still maintain population size. Does that make sense?
I thought you needed 2 offspring. Oh, each person needs to have 2 offspring, so each woman needs to have 4.
Yeah.
Yes.
And just to kind of draw a distinction here between that and like the math in Sanford's book, Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Genome, Sanford very strictly requires hard selection, right? He's talking about like how many people would have to die every generation, and that's not how selection works. It's not like either you have kids or you die. Like there's a lot of ground in between there. Do you have 1? Do you have 3? Do you have 10? Those are all going to affect, right, the genetic makeup of future populations in different ways without necessitating the death of an individual. So when you treat it with exclusively hard selection, you end up like every woman would need to have, however many kids it would be, right? And it's like at this ridiculous number, I think it's like thousands if you have like 100 mutations per generation, like per individual per generation. But that's only if you assume that the only way to get rid of the mutations is killing the people that have them before they have kids, and it's not how it works.
Yeah,
and it's just like
this is a really important point, right? Is that the math I just showed you and the math that like most genetic load, even like not even the silly genetic entropy, but like the genetic load actual PopGen models all assume hard selection, right? So they assume that selection is acting on like the absolute number of offspring you have, and so are impacting population growth rates. But there's another way that selection can act, and that's called soft selection. So in soft selection, selection is actually competitive. So it's relative to individuals. I had a commenter once that I think summed this up really well. It's that I don't need to outrun the tiger. I just need to outrun you, right? And so in this way, this is selection acting on the relative abilities of individuals as opposed to acting on the absolute numbers. And in fact, once you include soft selection, it completely obliterates the genetic load problem. And this is something we've known since the 70s. If you just transition to thinking about selection as a soft versus hard, you can actually get rid of the entire mutation load paradox falls apart. But like, they never talk about soft selection. I don't think most creationists are even aware that it's a thing. I've never seen anything that Sanford has written that even seems like he's aware that soft selection is something that exists.
Yeah, no, they don't know.
Okay.
Okay. This next bit, I'm going to play this for just a minute-ish. Here we go.
I would argue that fixation only exacerbates the problem. Okay, so any mutation that reaches fixation, if it is slightly deleterious, that is very small damage population-wide, where now it's not subject to selection because the entire population has that mutation now stuck in place. I think we'd agree with that. But genetic entropy still applies when mutations don't drift to fixation, because let's say, for example, in the human population today, we got about 7 to 8 billion people. Mutation rates about 100 per person per generation. That's 700 billion new mutations this generation alone.
Drink/bingo responsibly. Bingo responsibly.
And so those mutations will spread. They will lead slowly into genetic sickness. And by the time selection can see the damage, as you pointed out, everybody's multiply mutant. And so all it can ever do is slow down the genetic degeneration problem. Because let's say
Okay. So this is an example of what I think we've taken to calling the Donnie Deals fallacy, where we hear an argument, right? We respond to that argument, and Mr. Anderson in the previous segment that we played actually explained why what Donnie just said was wrong with his saying mutations accumulate, but then once you hit that threshold, subsequent mutations will be selected against, and because there's going to be variation in the population, they won't reach fixation. And then he comes back and says, but have you considered the thing I just said that you just addressed? It just comes back and says the same thing again in different words, but it's the exact same argument. We just like Mr. Anderson just explained why the thing he just described is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
This is why I go back and forth with this question. Like, he knows he's BSing, right? Like, he has to know.
Yeah, I also really hate the term multiply mutant. I think it has some really negative connotations. Like I'm thinking about like I'm really interested in like the history of eugenics, for example. So like the concepts of like multiply mutant, I think has some like problematic connotations. But also like it has an implicit assumption that there was a time at which there were no mutations. Right. And this is like an implicit assumption that only works if you literally start off with Adam and Eve in a Garden of Eden with a completely perfect genome, right? Like you have to assume the model to even make a statement like multiply mutant, right? Like individuals have always had genetic variation. It's part of every natural population. And in fact, if we didn't, we would be really bad off. When we look at populations that aren't multiply mutant, that have really, really low genetic diversity, we call them inbred. Right? We say that that's a population that's nearing extinction. Those are normally endangered populations that we care a lot, that we like are trying to protect. When we look at a population that has lots of genetic diversity, that's a highly multiply mutant population. And we would say that's a healthy population, has lots of diversity, right? And so like just the very idea, like when you use the word multiply mutant, it sounds really bad. When you say genetic diversity, which is really what we're talking about here, suddenly it sounds good, right? So this is like the way in which he's using these words, I think are giving across a false connotation of what we actually mean when we say these things.
Yeah. This was also the point at which I wanted to talk about lobster boiling pot times. You guys want to talk about that?
What I'm going to suggest is we don't talk about that because we still have quite a bit of stuff to cover here. And I think you did a really good job earlier of kind of dismissing that idea. So I think we can go to our next thing, but I want to just one quick thing before we do that. And it's this comment from Andrew in the chat here. You assume Donnie cares about eugenic attitudes when he regularly hosts borderline racist, I would even remove the borderline, and homophobic people on his channel. Yes, that would seem to be a problem, wouldn't it? Considering like the main source of revenue for the Standing for Truth organization is a convicted felon, absolute bigot, makes racist jokes on his channels, homophobic, all sorts of stuff. So I don't think
really the main source of revenue on that channel.
I would, Joel Duff a while back did kind of a deep dive into views and such, and found that Kent brings the views, and all those theological debates do not. Like if Kent was not ban evading by using Standing for Truth's channel as his main platform, then the SFT ministry would have far fewer eyeballs on it, let's say.
Okay.
Which I think explains why Kent is a fixture there.
Right.
I have opinions.
We shall talk further about that offline.
I mean, Kent. I'm gonna put a penny. I'll put a coin in the swear jar for this one. Kent is an asshole. Like, screw that guy. And like, Donnie's an asshole for hosting him. It's not more complicated than that. Like, it's what it is. Like, you should have the decency to just be like, you're not welcome on my channel. Like, this is a guy. Like, if you go down the Kent rabbit hole, sorry everybody, I'm gonna just hang out on my soapbox for a moment here. Then we'll get back to population genetics. But like, if you go down the Kent rabbit hole, you will find frequently just like straight up racist stuff on the various channels he uses, because his main channels got banned because of like the medical pseudoscience stuff they were peddling repeatedly, to the point where they got nuked from YouTube entirely.
He put some of that in the debate I had, in one of the debates I had. They had to edit it out. And it was like, eat peach seeds or something. It was
there's all that stuff, but then like going along with that, there's racist stuff, there's lots of like homophobic and transphobic stuff, and like he doesn't hide it. He just straight up it's just part of what he does. And like, it's one thing to like try to engage and like push back on that, like to be in the room and be like, no. It's another thing, because my attitude has changed on this. I said everyone boycott SFT, boycott Kent, and like he doesn't deserve the time of day. And I still think that's the case, but I don't think that's an effective approach because it only works if everybody does it, and it's clear that that's not going to happen. So now my thinking is like, yeah, people like you or me or somebody else should be in that room to push back on all this nonsense. But like, I see that as very different from somebody like SFT who's using that as like a revenue stream, right? Like that's, that's where the channel gets a bunch of their views. Like, Donnie, are you like, I would like to think you're better than this. I know that's like a running gag that everyone goes through, like the there's like this roller coaster ride of like, oh, you met SFT, he sounds cool. Yeah, I'll go on his channel and talk. And then like over the course of several months, you kind of like learn that he's like this weird capricious jerk, right? And part of that is hosting Kent all the time. It's all tied up together. Anyway, I'm gonna get off my soapbox now, but which is just to say, screw Kent. Donnie, I have a very low opinion of you, because I think you're dishonest with a lot of the stuff, but also because you continue to host Kent despite knowing about all his terrible behavior, and because you have said outright, he brings the eyeballs, so I'm going to keep doing it. Back to
I
population.
have a more charitable opinion of Donnie than that, but I think he's more complex than that. I think that I don't know. I think there's a showman side of him that he leans into sometimes and says things that maybe he knows aren't true because he thinks that it's an argument that can be made. And I mean, I don't know. I've talked to him and I think he's modulating on that to a degree. Like, I think he needs to get to a point where it's like you can say things and you can make arguments that you don't necessarily agree with as long as they're arguable. And
yes,
that's the limit, right?
And here's the thing, though, but he'll use arguments that he knows is wrong just to see if somebody will call him on it. And if he gets called on it, he'll move on. But if he doesn't, he'll just stick with it. Like earlier in this stream, the part that we cut out at the beginning because it wasn't relevant to genetic entropy, he does the mitochondrial Eve average mutations versus he talks about 20 whatever average mutations between people. He knows that doesn't matter. He knows you have to take the maximum divergence, not the average divergence. But he's going to take that. He's going to see if he can get away with it, right? And then if the person he's interacting with doesn't call him on it, then like, poof, we're done. He'll do that kind of crap. Have my opinion of him just gets lower and lower.
That's sort of, I think, you know what, he's entering into an academic arena and progressively as he's interacting more with, people who are academics and who are holding him to those higher standards. My hope is that he's learning about sort of what the limits are about, like what you can say, like, look, as a lawyer, like I have had to make arguments that I did not agree with for people I did not like.
You're
like
paid to do that for a living as your profession.
No, I know, but there's a limit for me, is what I'm trying to say, right? In that I will not, and I cannot, as like I have an ethical obligation not to make an argument that like I can make an argument that I disagree with, and I have to, right? But I'm not allowed to make an argument that I don't think is valid and that I don't think is true, right? Like I can't represent facts other than the way that they are. And if I honestly think that the law is a certain way, and that like you look at the case law, this is the way that it is. Like I cannot argue something that goes directly contrary to that. If it's murky, even if I think the weight is leaning one way, I can make the argument that's, and even if it's against my sort of personal opinion on what I think the law should be, I can make that argument. I can make that, with my head held up because it's, the law is unclear and, my obligation is to my client. Like I'm not supposed to do what is best for me when I'm acting, right? I'm supposed to do what's best for the person that I'm acting for, even when that is not in my personal best interest, right? So I have to make that argument, but there are limits. I do have a gatekeeper function, right? And I think that's something that I'm hoping we will work towards.
Donnie, prove me wrong. Because here's what I think is going to happen. Somebody over here, Kyle Pratt, I think nailed this. I think this is what's going to happen. I think you'll just follow the same path. Sorry, this is covering up your face in there when I pull the comment up. But I think this is what's going to happen: is that eventually you'll anger him sufficiently because you spank him enough times publicly, and then he gets annoyed with you, and you become persona non grata, and then you get like the ridicule and the harassing messages instead of the having a fun exchange. That is
maybe. I'm aware that there is that side is out there. I've seen enough videos. I'm wary of that. I'm just, I guess, hoping to put it off. If I can put it off indefinitely, and he and I can get along, we can make a lot of great content together, right?
Power to you. Good luck in your senior year, as they say.
Yeah. Welcome to Hollywood, as they say.
Yeah. All right. Should we talk about genetic entropy some more? Let me get this queued up here. Okay, we're gonna go for like a couple of minutes here. Sorry for that digression, everybody, but here we are.
Invoked really strong, intense selection, removed 50% of the worst mutants. So let's say you remove 4 billion people. Well, What are you left with? You're left with 4 billion people who are more mutant than the generation before it. Here's the last thing I'll say, because the whole point of genetic entropy is that every generation is more mutant than the previous generation. I'm more mutant than my parents. My parents are more mutant than their parents, and so on and so forth. Go ahead.
I don't think that's quite right. Like, the thing is that, so you are correct that there is such a thing that we call, like, I think it's called mutation load, right? Where we are all multiply mutant, right? But what happens is that instead of it being like a straight line that just continues to go up and up forever, what happens is that, like, there's a point, like what you're calling like the meltdown point, and portions of the population are going to hit that meltdown point before it fixes, and then they're going to suffer those effects, and then that, what I'm calling the straw that breaks the camel's back, gets eliminated. Now all the other straw that's on that camel's back is still there, and that's what they call the mutational load. And it's a thing, and it does cause us problems. And like, that's why, like, they say, like, women have, I think, like 2.5 births per woman or something like that. That's actually not quite correct. Like, women have more than that, because you're not counting all of the miscarriages that occur, many of which they don't even know about because they're aborted very early. Right. And that's because of the mutation load. And so it's a mutation load that we can and do bear because there's not a significant amount of investment in the fetus when the woman's body detects that we hit the reverse genetic lottery and we need to.
Wouldn't that be considered one of those big mutations that results in no reproduction? If it's a mutation in the zygote or the growing baby in the womb, well, that baby's not going to be born, and then there's going to be no reproduction. And so,
it's like I said, it depends. Like, a lot of these mutations, these like slightly deleterious mutations, are recessive, right? And a lot of times, like, they don't have any effect at all until or unless more than one of them is in the same person at the same time, not just homozygous, but like homozygous in multiple spots. And then sometimes,
and that's the problem is as
okay. So I want to pause it right there. I gotta highlight a couple comments here before we move on, because there's a couple important things here that people in the chat are catching on to, which just makes me so happy. And Zach, I think people are joining the pop gen kind of train here. So first, I just want to highlight this from our friend Ian Chen. Thank you for being here. And also, shame on you. This is terrible. So this is super chat for $7.99 Australian dollars here. What does Chinese food and genetic entropy mats have in common? For Zach, they both feature dim sums. Sir, that is not funny. That is terrible. As
dim sum, I like dim sum.
As a bad pun appreciator, I appreciate that, but how dare you subject my audience to that? So All right. The other thing I just want to point out, kind of going back a moment to something that we kind of touched on earlier, and also Zach, you've obviously talked a lot about this. This idea of like the perfect genome, it gets into some really ugly implications very fast, right? So the standing actually believes there is a pure human. Remember that, right? Like this has not great implications in terms of like, oh, there's a pure human, and how different are you from that ideal case? And then that gets into like racism and eugenics and stuff very, very immediately. So that's not good. And then one more comment here. I just want to point out, Mr. Anderson, people are picking up what you are laying down, right? Because the implication of what you have been saying is, yes, right? You reach an equilibrium point, right? And it's the thing that you were saying way back at the beginning of where we started this, right? You reach selection mutation equilibrium, where at some point it becomes a problem, and then selection operates against it and prevents fixation. Unless, I do want to say, I have had creationists say to me that at that meltdown point that you mentioned just in that little bit there, that people have said to me, no, the entire population hits that point at exactly the same time.
Yeah.
So
do you want to like, because I feel like slightly bad, like, watching this debate with the two people that I stole like a large number of these ideas from without footnotes. And like I should have like just been like writing asterisks on the screen, like, over and over again, because like that whole thing about like the mutation load firstly the whole thing about the straw that breaks the camel's back, and the part of the population hits that meltdown point before the other one. Like that's Dan, that I got that idea.
I did draw a figure of that at some point in the past. Yes, but I'm just happy people are like picking it up and applying it. That makes me super happy. And you're not just saying the words like standing is. You're actually like you're seeing what's going on under the hood, which is great. I'm
trying, and this whole thing about like the mutation load and the number of the homozygous thing, like that's straight out of like the Zach Hancock playbook. Like I didn't come up with that either.
Well, I'm flattered. Take my stuff, use it. That's the whole point of my channel, is like, here's how you use it.
Yeah,
that's the whole point.
Yeah,
literally.
And to be clear, like the concepts of the mutation load or the drift load or like all those things are like not mine, right? Like this is population genetics that's been around for like almost a century at this point. Like Haldane 37 was the first mention of the genetic load, and so like these guys could have learned all of this by just reading any book since from 1937 on, right? I do want to add just a real quick point on the mutation selection balance stuff, is that one of the things that's often left out here, like when we're thinking about straws breaking camels' backs, is that as you increase the number of deleterious mutations that you're getting, it's not merely that you have to worry about selection removing them. The thing that's often forgotten is that the more deleterious mutations you have, you're increasing the proportion of beneficial compensatory ones you can have.
Mm-hmm.
For every deleterious mutation, you have now increased the probability of getting a beneficial one as a back mutation, right?
Bingo.
So a lot of that balance is actually happening not necessarily by selection removing deleterious, but by the balancing of back mutations back to that to the more fit state. And there's actually a lot of like really good pop gen on this going back to the 1980s, in which you can actually see this sort of balance happening between it's actually called evolution, or what is it? It's like evolution without adaptation. And effectively what it is that you're having this sort of forward movement in evolution, but it's just compensatory. And so you're just kind of back mutating, and you're maintaining this fitness equilibrium by these back mutations. So I think that's something like these compensatory mutations I feel like aren't brought up enough in these conversations, but it's a really powerful and important thing that has strong theoretical backing.
I deliberately didn't bring it up because like this debate is already very technical and theory intense. And it was like, that's another good argument. And I just don't know if I don't know that Donnie's got the bandwidth in one hour and a half sort of session to like absorb that argument as well.
But if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. Right? Like if you want to talk about these complex pop gen topics, then he's got to be able to talk about these complex topics.
No,
And
that's not true, because like from a tactics, like from my perspective, right? You got to meet people where they are, and you can't, like, if you want to actually win an argument, right? You can't overload that other person with too many concepts, or they're going to stop listening, right? So you have
he
to.
wasn't listening in the first place, though. He'd been reading his slides.
No, I know what he does. He does by the end, semi listen to, like, some of the like catchphrases and stuff. And so, like, I mean, that's why we have probably not debated since, is because, he's still sort of struggling with, how do I get around the whole concept of, if it matters, it matters, and if it doesn't, it doesn't, right? Because that's becomes kind of insurmountable.
The way I always describe this, because this is like a foundational part of Sanford's genetic entropy model, is that the DFE, the distribution of fitness effects, stays constant even as mutations occur. So if it's 99.9% of mutations are harmful at one time point, you can have any number of mutations occur, and then at that time point, it's still the case that 99.9% of mutations are harmful, according to Sanford. That's just mathematically impossible, right? Because you have to hold everything constant, right? You treat just like, let's unrealistically assume that every mutation is associated with a specific fitness value. Once a mutation occurs, that mutation is now off the board, and the back mutation is now in play, right? A turns to G, that was harmful. Well, you can't do that mutation again, but that G can turn back into an A. That is necessarily beneficial now. And I always just describe this as, you've got 10 red lights, and one of them turns green, and the ratio of, the probability of flipping green to red, red to green, say it's wrong in genetics to say that's a constant thing, but like, let's just make it a constant rate. Sure, whatever, who cares? And like, okay, the first light turns from red to green. Now, instead of being 100% of the changes are going to be red to green, right? 9 out of 10 are red to green, and 1 out of 10 is green back to red. Once you get 5 green lights, now it's, assuming the rate is equal, now it's equal. If the rate is unequal, there'll be a different equilibrium point. But at some point, there's that equilibrium point there. And that's just never taken into account in any genetic entropy
But
model.
how much does that matter? Because I mean, and I say this kind of in a devil's advocate way, because I think I know the answer. But how much does that matter? Because I mean, like, if you have enough deleterious mutations accumulate, like, maybe we'll all be dead before we reach that point. Like,
that is the creationist argument, that sure, mathematically that equilibrium point exists, but you will die from genetic entropy first, right? That's what they say in response to this. Right. We have experimental and theoretical evidence that that's not the case.
But by the same token, like, I mean, I'm kind of thinking like, so, but hang on though, because if those mutations become too deleterious too quickly, then selection is going to see them and it's going to start weeding them out. And if they stay within that no selection zone, then, I mean, it may be that a lot of them can add up. Like, like, for example, Zach was saying, if they're more than 1 over the number of loci, then all of them can change. And then you have 100% chance of going back to something better. Or even, even if, like, let's say going to a T is bad, but going to a G is worse, and going to a C is even worse. Then I guess maybe you have like 4, that you can do, but like, so then even 4 times 1 over the 1 over G, like, there's going to be a limit at which it's like, straight up, there are no more bad mutations that can occur.
And right? And we're still also assuming a completely additive model here, right? We're assuming that these mutations are not interacting with one another at all. There's no epistasis. And we're assuming that these mutations are harmful enough, but not so harmful that selection doesn't see them. So like the actual range of mutations that we're talking about with selective effects that can actually accumulate and decrease fitness are pretty narrow given any effective population size, right? So the bigger it is, the narrower that range becomes. This is, again, going back to Donnie's no selection zone. And so there's a lot of additional parameters here that need to be evaluated and need to be estimated before they can really even test this model. And effectively what they need is a good distribution of fitness effects. And I've never seen them produce an empirical distribution of fitness effects that actually reflects that of humans.
They just used the one from Kimura 79, and they've been writing on that one since Sanford published the book in 2005.
Which is
Yeah.
funny that they love, Adam Air Walker and Keatley so much when they have done human distribution of fitness effects, but they don't want to use theirs because their distribution of fitness effects actually has like lots of like really strongly deleterious mutations. It also has a proportion of beneficial mutations. Like it's a realistic
Doesn't work.
distribution, but they don't want to use that
Yeah.
distribution. They'll cite their other papers though.
Right.
I just want to highlight this from Ian Chen again for $7.99 Australian dollars. Genetic entropy, it ain't what it used to be. Okay, sorry, Dr. Dan, I'll stop now, but I'm just showing support. I appreciate your support and generosity, Ian. Thank you. I also appreciate your terrible puns. I subject my students to just the worst puns. So I appreciate it. I just I can't speak for everybody else. And that one was pretty bad. That's which for me is great. I love it, but your mileage may vary. All right. I am going to play this video for about a minute. We have, by my estimation, we only have like 12 minutes left of video that we're going to play here. So I'm hoping we can come in at 2 hours. Let's see how we do.
Keep on dreaming, Dan.
I
You know what?
would
You
use
dream
an
about things
illustration.
that if you want to dream about things that aren't going to happen, like if you wish for world peace or something, like go big. If you're gonna,
Yeah, we could do the stream in 2 hours. All right, we'll see.
To make it more understandable for the audience, let's say you had a car lot and you had 350 cars. Over time, they're all accumulating damage. They're all accumulating rust molecules.
Can we just not? Can we just move to the next part, please? It's just
well, I wanted to give my counter example.
Stupid.
But some, for whatever reason, they're going to accumulate more damage and more rust molecule. Like a GM's probably going to turn into trash before maybe a Honda or a Toyota. Okay. So the point is, sure, those are going to be removed from the equation first, but that doesn't mean your Hondas, your Toyotas, your Nissans aren't also going to be subject to that same damage through rust. And eventually they're going to be wiped out as well, to the point where that entire car lot is done. And that's the same thing with the human population. Is yes, degeneration can be slowed. Some are more mutant than others, but all you ever get is a slowing of the degeneration process, because every generation is still going to be more mutant than the previous generation.
He has his script and he's sticking to it.
Okay.
God bless him.
Let's deal with this thing so that we don't keep hearing him say that nobody ever addresses it. I mean, he's going to keep saying that anyways, but at least it will be completely 100% untrue, right? So what's the problem here? Well, the analogy is not realistic, right? So in technical terms, and you guys can correct me if I misstate this, there isn't any recombination, there isn't any differential reproduction going on in this example. But using that technical jargon isn't always as effective as just altering the analogy and adding those concepts in. So let me show you what I mean. Let's say every week they take all the cars apart and then they randomly reassemble them, and just pretend that all the parts are interchangeable, right? Then you take your rustiest car, you get rid of it, and you replace it with another car that has exactly the same amount of rust overall as your least rusty car. So then how long until the whole lot rusts out? The answer, I would suggest, is never. Because you're always mixing things around, and your new cars are always going to be some combination of your best parts. So relatively good parts are always being introduced to the lot, and relatively bad parts are being removed. Moreover, those rustier parts are going to be more likely to be in the overall rustiest car, because the rustier the part, the greater the chance it's going to increase the overall rustiness of the car and make it so that one gets eliminated. So if we just add those two things in, we add recombination and we add differential reproduction, yeah, your car analogy, they never all rust out. Now, is this example perfectly reflexible of reality? No, of course it isn't. But it's better than it was before. And now we can kick it back to Donnie. And if he wants to suggest some other tweak, then he can, until we get something that truly is realistic. Until we get something that truly is realistic. I mean, that is unless your opponent has a tendency to ignore the fact that somebody has addressed or refuted one of their arguments and then just keeps making the same argument anyways, as if it's never been addressed. But we don't know anybody who does that, do we, Dan?
No, I can't think of anybody. Why would you even suggest such a thing? I couldn't
No.
think of anybody that does that exact thing over and over again over a period of years. Coming up blank. Sorry. Okay. Well, I'm on board with introducing recombination and selection into the equation. If we want to stick with the car analogy, I'm down. Zach, you down?
I mean, I find analogies just terrible. To me, they muddy everything, and you end up fighting about the specifics of the analogy, and then it's like,
Right.
I always get lost in the analogies. I would always rather talk biology. So for me, my big point is like Donnie, like there was no perfect human. There was no original car lot, right? Like genetic variation has always existed, and populations that have genetic variation are more healthy than those that don't have genetic variation. So in his model, you would have the car lot that had a bunch of rusty cars in it is actually better than the lot with no rusty cars. Right. And that's the biology we were comparing here, but it doesn't make sense in a freaking car lot because like that's not how the biology works. So like I get the intuition to want to use analogies. And if you think you can make a good analogy work, then like go for it. It's just like not the way I'm going to approach.
That's fair.
I just want to point out from Icarus here, he is a former used car salesman, as far as I know, and that's where the nickname Donnie Deals comes from, because those were, God, I wish I like downloaded those videos from Facebook, but they're all gone now, and man, they were amazing.
I see there's one of them. There's one kicking around somewhere.
There is still one out there. All right, there were like 4 or 5. Incredible. But I also just think the whole like former used car salesman thing is just like the writer's room is getting really lazy, because that is way too on the nose here. Just way too much. Yeah, they're getting lazy. All right. We're gonna do this for approximately the next oh my goodness, it's like 4 minutes. You're really gonna make us watch 4 minutes of this thing, Mr. Anderson? All right.
You know, I'm not making you do anything. You're here of your own free will.
I'm gonna do it.
Yeah. No. So here's the problem with that idea, as I understand it. Again, I'm not a population.
Wait, hang on. Are you gonna do the thing that you just did with the cars and the recombination and stuff?
No, no.
No. Okay.
Right. But my understanding is like, so, you know, you talk about like, well, let's give like the example, your classic example of a deleterious mutation, or a slightly deleterious mutation that you would say does not affect fitness, right? So, you know, the 2 examples I hear you give all the time are the Paul Price example, which is, you know, he has asthma, and so his breathing is like slightly affected, but he can still have kids, right?
I kind of like the age one better if you want to use
the age one.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's do the age one then. So, so the age one is that, like, you know, look, there's this deleterious mutation, and it like reduces your lifespan by 2 years, right? So, you know, you would otherwise have lived until 70, but now you're only going to live until 68. And so the argument is that that's not going to affect your ability to have kids. It's just going to mean that you die sooner, which sucks for you, but it's not a mutation that evolution can see, right? Like, have I fairly represented your example?
Yeah, I think you're doing well. I would say, okay, you get a mutation that affects, like you said, let's say the lifespan by 2 years. And so I'm able to live to 70. And then my kids, because of that mutation they've inherited, now they're only able to live to 68. That's not going to stop them from being able to have really as many kids as possible. But then the next generation, you know, they only live their maximum lifespan 66. But again, that's not going to stop them from being able to have kids.
Pause. So number one, we're way ahead of ourselves. So let's just talk about the first mutation.
Okay.
Where
the first generation.
Yeah, where you're saying like, look, me living until I would otherwise have lived until 70. People live a range of, you know, of ages, right? But I would otherwise have lived till 70, but I'm only going to live till 68 now, because of this particular mutation. And the idea is, or the argument is, that that is a mutation that selection cannot see, right?
Selection cannot see it. It
Because
has no effect immediately on reproduction, but one would be insane to say that it's not deleterious in some way.
right. And the thing is that in population genetics, they would assign like they would assign an
value?
S coefficient to that. And the reason that they would
Right.
do that is because just because you've had your kids already doesn't mean that your life doesn't matter in the evolutionary sense. Because
Just pause there.
if I died 2 years earlier than I otherwise would.
Yeah, I think we can probably skip some of this. So the point there was kind of that is that the when Donnie talks about slightly deleterious mutations that selection cannot see, the examples that he chooses are examples that produce selectable effects, right? Like this notion of like something that decreases your lifespan by 2 years, even though it might do it at the end after you already had your kids, like, you know, you guys can correct me on this, but my understanding is like it doesn't necessarily matter exactly just how many kids you have. It's about how many grandkids you have that survive, right? So like if you are going to live longer and you're going to be able to help raise those grandkids, and, you know, like when mom's out, there's a grandfather there that protects them from a lion, you know, like that's going to mean that more of those grandkids survive. And like we attach an S coefficient to that. And it might be a soft selection coefficient, or it might not be a very large coefficient, but there's a selection coefficient attached to something like that. Or there's a selection coefficient attached to not having, you know, to having asthma. That is a selectable trait. It's not a hard selection immediate trait, but over time, when we got 7 billion people, those kinds of things are selectable. When we're talking about slightly deleterious mutations, we're talking about changes that are like tiny, like, you know, that the cell has a bunch of extra energy, but, you know, maybe like that excess budget is slightly smaller because, you know, there's slightly more, I don't know, there's an addition of you know, the genome got slightly longer. And so we're using like one more ATP worth of energy, and like technically that is deleterious, but you're never going to notice it. You're never going to tell. Like we're not talking about it takes 2 years off your life.
Yeah. So there's kind of two things going on here. One is that like the selection coefficient can be, and this kind of gets back to Air Whiteley and Keatley. The selection coefficient can be so small. Let's say it's 1 out of 100 billion. Right. You can think about how many generations would have to accrue for one individual to be lost because of this mutation. Right. A ton of generations, despite the fact that we're at 7 billion individuals. Right. So like that's still a selective effect, and that still has an S coefficient to it. It's just incredibly small. Right. Mm-hmm. So like all of these things you can always assign, and maybe every single mutation, maybe there truly is no strictly neutral, such that there is always some effect, but it's so infinitesimally small that it doesn't matter. It definitely doesn't satisfy that S must be greater than 1 on G, right? Where 1 on G is the genome size. The other thing that I've always found really curious about creationists thinking they're very cute with this example is they just rediscovered the shadow of selection, right? Like this is Peter Medawar's concept of why we age. This is like a staple in evolutionary biology of why we get old at all.
I'm just gonna pull up this comment here from CRISPR-Cas9, life history trait evolution. This is a thing. This is a thing. We know how this works. Like this is a well-studied thing. You can the whole concept of a post-reproductive lifespan, and for what fraction of your life are you reproductively active or caring for your kids, and then for what fraction of your life are you no longer reproductively active but still providing resources to the younger generations. Those are phenotypes that are operating under selection. Like learn something, please. Donnie, just like anything, just pick something, anything.
Yeah, they are. And like the reason
so
why
like, these are not examples of traits that fall within that no selection zone. Like by no stretch of the imagination are these unselectable traits, these two examples that they've given. those are selectable.
I
Right?
think so. I think there's a range at which like you could live, let's say 198. Like there is some range at which losing age is so beyond, like there's so few individuals in that age class that drift is always going to be greater than selection, because the number of individuals in that age class is so small. And so like you can think about, just like we think about the rate of genetic drift versus selection at a population level, you can also think about it in age classes, right? So the number of individuals alive at age 40, 50, 60, et cetera, eventually you get to such a high age that so few individuals alive, or so few individuals are still around because of just like chance processes have killed them by this point, right? That like no matter how bad the mutation is or how much it would take off their life, it's going to persist, just because drift is always more powerful if your N is 10. Right? Like there's, maybe 10 people alive in the world that are 110 years old, right? Like that's such a ridiculous age. And so like,
Right.
if you had a mutation that you gave to your child that made them live to 105, like that's going to get passed on as if it's totally neutral, because there's so few individuals to select between. Does that make sense? So
Right, sure. But if we're talking about 70 to 68, or we're talking about 50 to 40, 45 or something, that's quite different.
Exactly. And there are like historically, like especially males will still be having children historically or in those ages. So that's like still a reproductive age for many males throughout human history. But like Dan brought up this important point, is that there's also a kin selection component to this, right? And that if I have a high probability, which you do, right? It's a 50% probability that I gave a particular allele to grandchildren or, great-grandchildren, et cetera. If I'm around to help them out, then I'm actually increasing the probability that allele gets passed to further generations. And so there's still a selective effect there. In humans, it's probably not super strong because our effective size is relatively small. But in other organisms that have really big population sizes, like this sort of grandmother effect can have a really big impact on why you see these social systems evolve.
I want to just point out two quick things here and then highlight a couple comments. But somebody in the chat here said you hitting the pause button on Donnie's script, which is exactly right. And like, yes, I am a fan of that kind of approach as well, of like, stop, we know the script, like talk like a human, don't just read your script. And then the technique that you have highlighted on your channel, you're doing here, the very specific like cross-examination technique of, do you agree with this? Yes. Do you agree with this? Yes. And like leaving Donnie in this case very little leeway to kind of wiggle out of the specific thing you're talking about. I want everybody to note that technique. And if you ever find yourself in a room like this, because I know the people here, we all have the same problem to some degree, that we like to argue with creationists. So I want to just highlight some of the techniques that we can all kind of pick up from Mr. Anderson here.
Well,
and
let's talk a little bit about that then.
Hang on just one second. I do want to just highlight Dr. Tapioca Weasel, new channel member. Thank you. If you're a member, you get access to pre-recorded videos early whenever I upload them. There's one available right now. And then Michael Apple, $5 super chat. Paying for the immense patience of Dr. Dan seems only fair. I just want to also spread that to Zach and Mr. Anderson, because man, it just crimes against population genetics are being committed here. Sorry, Mr. Anderson, please go ahead. Talk about debate techniques here.
Just so that I can, kind of add a little bit of my, expertise in this, because most of this has been, you guys telling me about population genetics. So like, in terms of, there's a couple of things that are going on in this past segment, right? So one of the things that Dan was talking about in terms of, you agree with this, right? You agree with this, right? Those are called leading questions, right? And you probably often heard like, objection, leading the witness. That's for your witnesses, right? So you're not allowed to do that when it's your witness. And the reason for that is that the court doesn't want to hear the story coming out of the lawyer's mouth. So if it was like, and then you went to the house, right? Yes. And then you picked up a knife, right? Yes. And then you stabbed the guy, right? Yes. It's like, I don't want to hear it from you. I want to hear it from him. So that's why it's not allowed in direct when it's your witness. When it's the other guy's witness, you always lead. And so in this context, with a, with somebody like a creationist who's resistant to, saying anything, bury the answer that you're looking for in the question so that there's no room. Like it's a yes or no question, right? I'm giving you a fact and I'm feeding it to you and I'm asking you whether it's true. It's like, are you putting words in my, I had somebody actually say this to me once, in a real cross-examination. They're like, you're putting words in my mouth. I'm like, yes, I am. And I'm asking you, are those words true? That's how we do it. And then the other thing that I'm doing, because Johnny has a tendency, especially when he starts to get uncomfortable, of like going off on just a rant and a run and saying like 10 interestingly wrong things, right? And then he'll just if you let him go, he'll just keep going. He'll be like, I'm getting to the point. And so like to forestall that, what I tended to do, especially in this debate, is when he started to ramble, and like once he switched to topic number 2, I would just say, you've lost me. Like I am not
good. I
following
like
you.
that.
There's no point in you continuing to talk because I do not understand what you're saying. I can't relate it back to like, we're not together anymore. You're going to like, you may be there. You need to come back and pick me up. Right. Because there's either you've said something, you've assumed something that is not actually, true. You said something that I don't think is correct, or I don't understand what you're saying. We need to go back and address whatever that is that I have a problem with. Otherwise, we're not on the same train, right?
I like that approach a lot. I dig that. I think I'm going to try to use that one. You lost me. Go back. Try again. Stick with that one thing. Yeah, I like that a lot. All right. I jumped us forward a bit. So we have looks like about 2 minutes, 3 minutes.
Do you want to talk about the statistics thing? Or do you want to just jump to the next?
So I was going to go. I thought we were done with that last segment, and we're going to jump to the next one that was up a little bit, and then we only have 5 total minutes left of debate here on our little time points that we've annotated. So we're going to hit about 2 minutes here, and then we'll jump a little bit, and we'll have about a minute, and then we'll jump again, and we'll have about 2 more minutes, and folks, I see there's 84 people. What is wrong with all of you? We've been doing this for 2 hours and there's 84 of you here for my time, almost midnight. Thank you all for being here. Thank you. I appreciate it. This is fantastic. I'm having a great time, Zach and Mr. Anderson. I hope you are. Let's keep watching.
This has been an absolute joy for me. This is the pinnacle of my YouTube career thus far.
Keep going up from there. So let's watch. What are we up to? About 2 minutes of this, and then we'll see.
To make a point about what I see you and your evolutionist friends, and feel free to push back on this, but I see you guys magically making the no selection zone unrealistically small to see every tiny mutation, basically to transition it from drift to selection midway through. That seems to be what you're saying, that at first they're unselectable, selection can't see them, but eventually they're going to amount to a point where now they are seen by selection. So it's gone from drift, they've been drifting, but now they reach a point where selection can see them.
Well, I mean, the thing is, like, so, you were talking about, like, there's going to be this genetic meltdown, right? Mm-hmm. What I'm saying is that point of genetic meltdown, like that, at that point, that change, which would otherwise cause the genetic meltdown, will never reach fixation, because genetic meltdown is a very deleterious thing. And so what'll happen is that you're going to hover right underneath that genetic meltdown point, and then parts of the population are going to go over it, and they're going to have that effect, whether that's a minor effect or a major effect, but let's assume it's a major, because genetic meltdown sounds like it's going to be pretty major, right?
Right.
So when part of the population accumulates that last little bit that, bam, we're in genetic meltdown, they will suffer that effect, and they'll get eliminated. And then everybody else is going to hover right under the line. And then somebody else, that mutation is going to happen somewhere, and they're going to go above the line. Genetic meltdown is going to happen for them, It's never going to fix. They'll die, and you'll go
It
down
just-
again, right?
it just
It'll go
seems
like
like-
this. It'll go. And
It
it's going to
just seems
hover
like such
right
wi-
at that genetic meltdown. It's going to walk that line, and it'll do that forever.
It seems like hope, dream, and imagine, right? That whales
No.
So I like I'm laughing for a couple of reasons here. One, because I know exactly what you're referring to there, Mr. Anderson, because I drew that figure. That is a figure that I drew.
I'm aware.
But also, I know exactly what Donnie is going to say here because I've heard him say it a million times. It's always the same thing. But this is what he tried to articulate there is the time bomb thing. And it's like, no, it's not, he doesn't even understand like the mechanism that he thinks is operating because he will describe this. There's no effect, there's no effect, there's no effect, there's no effect. Now there's an effect. And then like, but he thinks that when you're putting it back at him, that it's like there's, as he says, there's like a magical switch from drift to, and that's not what happens. And like, I go back and forth and it's agonizing. Is he actually this dense or is he just faking it?
Well, I mean, here I think, like I said, I think Donnie. I think that you give Donnie. I think you're. I don't think you're being unfair with Donnie because of the experiences which I've seen you have with him, right? You are a product of your environment. I think that to some extent, like what's going on here is there's a little bit of cognitive dissonance because he's been presented with this argument now and kind of beat over the head with it a bunch of times. And I think he's really struggling with it. And he doesn't want to admit that he's got a problem, right? Like he doesn't have a response to this argument. He didn't have a response to that argument at the time. He doesn't now. And I think that kind of might be one of the reasons why we haven't debated since. And because, he's starting to talk about it again a little, but it seems like his counter is something along the lines of, nuh-uh. Or, you can't shrink the no selection zone, but it's like the population size is shrinking it. I'm not doing it. I'm not doing anything. The math is shrinking it. Like you can dislike that as much as you want, but you might as well scream at the sky.
Yeah, the selection zone is set by the effective population size. And that size is what it is. And so I don't know what he thinks we're doing by shrinking this zone. Like it's a value, right? It's set by the rate of genetic drift. It's not something we just picked at random, right? Like we're not arguing over how to do it. We already know how to set what this zone is. So yeah, I don't know.
And if you got 8 billion people, then any of the mutations that get through that gauntlet they're going to be very, very close to neutral. Because selection's very efficient at that population size.
So I'm gonna take this opportunity to put up the poll that I teased at the beginning here because we've seen a whole lot of this, and we all have opinions, and I think some of them are conflicting opinions. My opinion changes minute to minute sometimes as we watch this stuff. So tell me what you think. Does he not understand any of it? Does he know better and he's just lying? Is he faking the whole shtick? I don't know. Tell us what you think, everybody. I'll close the poll at some point. So I jumped us ahead here. We just have about a minute-ish for this part, and then we'll chat again.
Genetic diversity, right? But
right.
What I'm saying is that I've never heard
as usual. Yeah, as usual.
I've never heard a creationist ever say ever that any mutation was good ever, right? Like I've seen like evolutionists give examples of like nihilase. Nope, that's not good. Citrate. Nope, that's not good.
Because I think
nope, that's not good. Like they're all not good.
It's context dependent though, so it can be good.
If it's context dependent, then the whole model of genetic entropy falls apart. I just want to start there. What he just said, that one sentence, 4 words, it's context dependent though. That means genetic entropy doesn't work.
Right.
Like, just straight up. And he doesn't understand it.
Yeah. I think like the point here for me is like, people talk about, and this kind of, it gets very quickly into this philosophical concept of information, right? And whether or not information is a thing, and whether or not there's any mutation that can create new information. And my view on this has become, I don't think information as they define it exists at all, nor is it necessary for evolution. Like, just straight up, you want me to show you new information? Show me existing information. I don't think it exists, because I think that here's the problem. I think this is when the creationists say information, what they mean is ideas, right? And ideas are things that have to be created by a mind. And so in order for there to be a new idea, a mind has to put that new idea in there. And so it's impossible for random things to create new ideas. It just doesn't happen. When evolutionists say information, we mean data. And data can be created whenever there is, a change. If there's a duplication event in a genome, that's new data. If that duplication event subsequently undergoes a mutation, that's new data. To us, that's information. To them, it cannot be, right? And so, like, asking us to show where there are new ideas from a mind that are written into a genome, when we don't think that there are any at all to start with, is dumb.
I mean, there comes a point to where they are just putting their heads in the sand, right? I mean, like, we have given them countless examples, and there are literally thousands of studies of this, right? Like, there are whole subfields that are dedicated to the evolution of new genes. Like, there are entire subfields of this. There are review papers of like hundreds of studies that have done this. We've seen them from completely non-coding areas, so just arising completely de novo, right? We've seen them from duplications. We've seen them from like retro elements being inserted and co-opted. We've seen new genes emerge in so many ways, both in nature and in the lab. It's just like, at this point, like, no definition can possibly satisfy them, because they just are rejecting every feasible biochemical way that it could happen in the first place, right?
And creationists will occasionally be honest about that. So, like Paul Price, when I chatted with him back in the fall, like, and we were talking genetic entropy, and at some point I just said, stop, like, you're saying information, you got to quantify that, you got to define it. And his answer, with some pushing, was to say, we can't. He just straight up copped to it, said, we creationists cannot define information.
It was kind of a, when you see it sort of thing.
Yeah. It's like, okay, thanks for playing. We're done then.
I said to Ken Hovind at some point, I was like, go outside and get me a bucket of information. Paint it red.
I do need to just highlight a super chat from Pibblepunk, half dog, half canine, which I love. That's fantastic. So you get like the half human, half ape thing. It's the same formulation there. Among the concepts they refuse to understand, it's not survival of the fittest, it's survival of the good enough. That is an important kind of concept when we're talking about genetic entropy. We're not doing this like optimal genome thing. And we've always been, Mr. Anderson has been describing being right on this edge of where you're good, you're not good. And like, all life has always been right on that edge. And the way to think about evolution is building up to it rather than degrading towards it, right? We're always building up, right? As from the origins of life, you achieve a certain degree of heritable biochemical activity. You're building up to that standard, that thing that we call life that replicates, and it's crossing that line from the bottom, not falling through it from the top. And as Zach said earlier, creationists have this misconception that there's this perfect genome up here and we're degrading from that. And that's just like, that's 180 degrees from how all this stuff actually works. We have just a couple more minutes here. we have, let's see, we'll go to 1. Here we go. Okay, we have about 2 to 3 minutes here. And then, friends, this is our last segment that we're going to watch. So here we go.
Genetic entropy is identical to their argument for evolution over time. But let me ask you something real quick.
You lost me on that one.
Let me
Well,
ask you,
hey,
do
T-Rod,
you
is this what
feel
you're
like-
saying? Because now they want to make that no selection zone even smaller.
I just need to say this is a deep cut if you're not a political obsessive like I am, but he's doing the Marco Rubio in New Hampshire thing where he like glitched out and just said the same thing like 4 times in a row in like a 15-minute span. In that this was back in 2016 in a primary debate. It was the Chris Christie Marco Rubio murder suicide on the debate stage, and like he's doing the thing where he just like buzzword. I'm going to say the same thing I've said 4 times already in this. How many times has he said that already with no selection zone?
That's the only, like, that's his objection to this argument is you're shrinking the no selection zone. And I'm like, I mean, yeah, that we are, and that's bad for you. And I get that, but there's nothing you can do to stop it.
Are you putting words in my mouth? Yes.
We
I'm
just
asking you,
really need
are those
him.
words true?
We really need him to tell us exactly what defines the no selection zone, and not in like these wishy-washy phrases. Like, be very precise and tell me exactly what defines the no selection zone. I would love for him to do
Well,
that.
Zach, he's going to invite you on at some point. The letter's in the mail. We've been waiting on it for a while, but apparently it's going to happen. And what you should say is, like Donnie, I'm going to bring my whiteboard. You bring a whiteboard. We'll walk through it together.
We will. Donnie, I will walk you through the math. Please, I will walk you through it.
We could do like a 2-on-2, you and me and Paul Price and Donnie.
We could do it.
I'd love that.
I would watch that. I would watch.
Because enough mutations amount to where now they are subject to selection, and so they're just nearly neutral, right?
Well, that was one of the other points I was going to make too, though, is because
because now that's fewer mutations drifting to fixation to help with forward evolution.
No, it's just that it's no.
Yes,
Johnny,
yes.
no. That you're missing.
You wanna
Just forward evolution, bingo / drink.
shrink that no selection zone.
What I'm saying is that as the population gets larger,
Yeah.
the mutations which are selectable also increases, and so the mutations which drift to fixation,
If they're
as the
selectable,
population-
they're not subject to genetic drift, though.
Exactly.
Exactly.
So the ones that make it to fixation are closer and closer to neutral. Their
so
deleteriousness
I just want to say
decreases as the population
you're undermining the whole basis of the molecular clock, because now you have fewer mutations reaching fixation because now they are under selection. But you need more mutations reaching fixation. But now they've gone from nearly neutral to, well, you call them nearly neutral because eventually they can be subject to selection, and so now they're not subject to drift. Now
So
they're
one
not
of the-
going to drift to fixation.
Here's
One of
the
the points
here's
that needs
here's
to
the
be
solution
made-
to that problem. Just hang on, T-Rock. I got this one. Here's the solution to that problem. Do you remember you showed me a slide before and it said that the number of neutral mutations which are going to reach fixation is not going to be dependent upon population size, because as the population size increases, selection increases, but also the number of mutations which are introduced increases.
Right.
So the way that the neutral mutations, that there are still the same number of neutral mutations that reach fixation, even though selection is going to see a larger percentage of them, is that the number of neutral mutations which are introduced to the population will increase corresponding to the increase.
I would argue that those mutations that are reaching fixation are still slightly deleterious, and we could go down the route of junk DNA all day.
So here's how you know you got him, is that in the span of like 30 seconds of talking, he introduced 2 different topics that were not the thing that you're talking about, right? He does junk DNA and he does molecular clock. And just need to point that out, everybody. This right there is the classic Gish Gallop. Oh, we're going to talk about this other thing, right? Now you got to chase me down that rabbit hole. No. You got to stay on topic, please.
So the reason I wanted you to play this clip is because this is sort of my proudest moment, because that thing about the molecular clock, where he kind of threw that at me, he's like, you're undermining the molecular clock. I came up with the response to that in real time. Like, I had not heard that argument before. I didn't have that figured out. I figured that out in that moment. I was like, oh no, like this makes sense. Yeah, just go back to that slide. This is the end, this is the response. And I was like, good job, Mr. Anderson. That was a nice one.
Yeah, Donnie says this all the time, right? That as soon as we say, like purifying selection is removing any of these deleterious variants, then he quickly pivots to, well, you've then undermined the molecular clock, right? Which he seems to fail to understand that the existence of the molecular clock is not dependent on any explanation as to why the molecular clock exists. So when Kimura derived the expectation for why a molecular clock exists based on the rate of drift, he did that ad hoc. Like, we already could observe a linear relationship between, genetic divergence and time, right? So if there's a linear relationship, there is a molecular clock. Why is there a molecular clock? Kimura said that it was drift. Another possible explanation is that you have an equal number of deleterious mutations that occur every generation, and that selection is constantly sort of purging those. And so you have this low level of sort of background mutations that go to fixation. And this is the same constant rate of an accumulation, just like you would expect under drift. So selection can lead to a molecular clock in the same way that drift can. So it's not that it's undermining the molecular clock, it's just undermining one particular explanation of the molecular clock, and that's the drift explanation.
I don't think Donnie would understand that. If you were to say that to him,
I thought I said that like in pretty basic terms.
No, I'm not. No, I think you did a great job explaining that.
You're an excellent science communicator. That's not the problem.
Right. That's the problem here is that was an excellent
also, if Donnie would just have me on to talk about this and we could just chat about it, maybe I can help clarify some of this with him.
Sweet summer child, thinking that would work. I bless your heart. That was great, because that was like the kind of thing that I would. It was like a little mini creation myth in there. Like, having selection undermines the molecular clock. I'll just play that and I'll be good. That'll be a video at some point.
Hey, clip it. That's you have my permission.
There we go. I also just want to point out that Mr. Anderson has a video on his channel called Stay on Target with the exact correct thumbnail that is basically about this, of like, hi, you're jumping around. You need to focus on this exact one thing. Like, stop talking about other things that are not the thing that we're talking about. And because
I'm pink that you've watched my videos. That's
I am on spring break right now. I had on my to-do list watch Mr. Anderson's videos, and I dig it. I people should go watch them. I also, because it's late and we're a little loose here, so I'm gonna just highlight this comment because somebody gets me. This is the thing that Marco Rubio glitched out on, but he was talking about President Obama at the time, and I just Pegajace, I hope I pronounced that correctly. You get me. Thank you. All right.
The result of the poll.
Oh, the result of the poll was in third place with 15%. Donnie is faking the whole Yek shtick, which I think that's probably the least likely explanation. In second place with 31%, Donnie does not understand any of this. And in first place with 53%, Donnie knows better and is lying.
Oh.
And I tell you, I go back and forth between those top two there. I go back and forth. I really genuinely do. And I don't know the answer, because there's only so many times somebody can, like Zach just did, like explain something very clearly, and then you subsequently just say the wrong thing again. There's only so many times that you can do that, and I start to think you're just BSing everybody, right? Like, and I've seen this dance done a number of times.
Stuff can be two things.
I don't know, man.
Right? Maybe sometimes it's one and sometimes it's the other, and sometimes,
Folks, it has been, we're coming up on 2 hours, 20 minutes here, folks, and we have gone through a big chunk of that genetic entropy debate between Donnie Deals and Mr. Anderson. So I'm going to take us out here. What I want to do is first thank you all. There's still 76 of you here. Thank you all for being here and spending this time with us. I've had a grand old time. I hope you've all enjoyed it too. Before we go, Mr. Anderson, you again have a newly minted YouTube channel. Tell everybody what's coming up, what's on the horizon, what your deal is. Make the pitch.
Yeah. So, like Dan said, I mean, my focus here is more on the technique of how to pin people down and force, reluctant people to face the truth. And so a lot of my videos are kind of like, I'll take a theme of, like, this is how you do sort of this aspect of things. And I'll take highlights from debates that I've actually done where you can see somebody who knows what they're doing, actually doing the thing that I'm saying to do, and you can see it working against people who are good at dodging. So, like, I mean, a bunch of my debates, or a bunch of the examples I've taken from recently are like Kent Hovind, who is good at dodging, right? And I'm like, I pin him down anyways because I'm doing this methodically, and it's not an accident, and it's not, there's technique to this. So it's about trying to nail those things down. And I think the next one is probably going to be Follow the White Rabbit, which is basically the opposite of Stay on Target. So there's contradictory advice, but it's not really contradictory when you properly understand it. So the idea is that, you have these questions and you have goals that you are trying to achieve, and you need to make sure that you keep those in mind. But you can't just, follow your script, right? Even if it's a custom written script, you have to be listening to the questions or listening to the answers and questioning off the last answer, because when you follow that white rabbit, every once in a while, it's going to lead you to Wonderland. And the example that I'm going to be, giving you is, an example I had where I was cross-examining this this guy on the heat problem, and he just started giving up like, bangers, right?
That was an incredible stream. That stream was incredible. And I really can't wait for that video, because I watched that stream live, and I remember, and I was chatting with some friends while we were all watching it, having just a grand old time. That guy came in there to solve the heat problem, and he was just like, nope, got nothing. It was amazing.
Yeah. And it just, and that, like, I got some great admissions out of that guy, and I never would have gotten them if I hadn't been listening to what he said, and then follow the white rabbit, right? Question off the last answer. Sometimes you need to be flexible, right? And so that's probably the next one I'll do.
Folks, I put Mr. Anderson's channel. There's a link in the chat. What are you doing? Click on that link, hit subscribe, and there you go. That's a taste of what you're going to get. It's fantastic. Zach, what are you up to? What do you have on the horizon?
I've been real busy with work. I have some papers in revision that we are trying to get out. So I've got a lot of work stuff going on, including I've had a 100% open access evolution project that I started last May. And you've seen maybe some previews of this a little bit in a couple of my videos. It's actually the background whenever you go to my YouTube page. It's like the first little pinned video. That has made some significant progress. So I'm hoping to be pretty close to like getting that into some manuscript form. So maybe we'll start seeing this put together here soon. The next video that I'm working on is continuation in my causes of evolution. So we're going to go back to some math. We're going to do gene flow is the next mechanism we're going to talk about. Which is my favorite one.
At all. I'm very excited now.
So gene flow is I'm technically a spatial population geneticist. I work on populations that live in sort of continuous space. So gene flow is like my bread and butter. So we're going to get into not only sort of like the basic migration models, but I'm also going to talk to you a little bit about a model that I've developed since I've been a postdoc here. So I'm really excited to try to like bring that down, share it to everybody on YouTube. So that's the next thing that I'm doing.
That's awesome. I look forward to that. The Mechanisms of Evolution series is great. Everybody, just like in terms of just like background, be fluent in kind of the general underlying things that are driving all this stuff we're talking about. Hard to beat that series. Everyone should check it out. Um, Zach's channel link is also in the chat. Once again, if you are not subscribed, what are you even doing here? Click it, hit subscribe. There's a bunch of you here. Just go do it. And then for me, I have I have a video that's ready to go. Recorded it, got it edited and uploaded just a couple days ago because spring break, I get to do stuff. So next week I have a video. It's already there for channel members, and everyone else will get it next Wednesday. It's a kind of fun one. I like it. It's actually kind of funny. Some of the stuff we talked about today comes up in the one next week. And then I have another thing on the horizon that I don't have a date for yet, but I can't wait. I'm really excited about it, and I will share more when I can. I'm very excited to share it with all of you. I'm hoping I can do that very soon. And I'm just going to leave it at that. It's going to be great. So with that, everybody, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Mr. Anderson. This is just a delightful 2.5 hours to spend with the two of you and our friend Donnie. And we are going to call it a night, everybody. I hope you all have a good night. Stay safe. Subscribe to everybody here. Do all the algorithm-friendly things for everybody. And I'll see you next week, I hope. See you whenever. Bye, everyone. Have a good night.